Yeah, in case some of you are new, Pastor John won't be speaking today. Occasionally, Pastor John lets me out of the closet, and I get to speak. And today is one of those days. So my name is Blaine Charette. I'm a professor at Northwest University. So it'll be a little bit different from, well, you saw, if you're new here, you saw John earlier. It's always dangerous to give John the mic. Whenever John does transition and I'm speaking, I never know if I'm going to ever get up to the stage, because you never, but anyways, so let's begin. As you probably know, today, in terms of like the church calendar, is Palm Sunday, right? So it's the day that starts what is sometimes referred to as Holy Week, which looks on that last week of Jesus' life. As we know, this Friday's Good Friday, next Sunday, Resurrection Day or Easter Sunday, sometimes called Passion Week, because again, having to do with the sufferings of Jesus. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about that day, okay, what we often refer to as Palm Sunday. And if we could look at the first slide here, the title here might suggest I'm talking about the second coming, okay? When Jesus comes, what will he say? Or what will he say to us, okay? But as I was looking at this passage, we're going to be looking at Luke's account of Palm Sunday. As I was looking at this, there's a lot of parallels between that coming of Jesus to Jerusalem on that day and when he comes ultimately at the end of history. Because as Luke describes it, and unique to Luke, it's a time of visitation. Jesus comes to Jerusalem and essentially gives Jerusalem an assessment, okay? And sadly, he weeps over the city on that occasion, okay? So let's look at the meaning of Palm Sunday here. Let's just read through this passage. As they brought the colt to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on it, they placed Jesus on it, and he rode along, and as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. When he was approaching the road down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples began rejoicing, praising God with a great voice for all the works of power they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, "I say to you, if these were silent, the stones would cry out." Okay. Now, you'll probably notice there that I put Palm Sunday in quotation marks. And that's because, as you probably notice here, there's no palm branches, okay? There's 4 accounts. One of the beautiful things about the New Testament is we've got these 4 Gospels. Because obviously, Jesus is so important. He's very central to the Bible, obviously, right? Jesus is the central figure of the Bible. And therefore, it takes more than just one gospel or more than just one account to do justice to Jesus. So we end up having 4 different gospels, or 4 very different perspectives on the life and ministry of Jesus. And when we put all that together, they give us, it's not surprising that we know more about Jesus than any other figure in the ancient world, okay? Nobody from the ancient world had this done for them, right? And these 4 very interesting descriptions. So it's in John's gospel that the people cut down palm branches and lay that out in front of Jesus as he's riding towards Jerusalem, okay? And that sort of kind of sticks. If we're going to be faithful to Luke, we'd have to call this Garment Sunday, okay? Or Cloak Sunday. Because even Mark and Matthew have people cutting down branches, but as you'll see here, only in Luke, what do the people do? They lay their cloaks or they lay their outer garments on the path before Jesus. But Garment Sunday doesn't have quite the same ring as Palm Sunday. So we'll go with Palm Sunday. But again, just to note, and there's reasons why. And part of the basically I study the Gospels. That's my main thing, because I'm always fascinated with how these different gospel writers, how they emphasize different things. And we'll look at a moment why Luke chooses to place the emphasis just on garments. But let's move to the next slide and look at, again, try to unpack the meaning of this occasion. Okay, so obviously what's important here is that Jesus enters Jerusalem. Okay. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, that's the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One thing that's very interesting about how they structure the story of Jesus is that he only goes to Jerusalem at the very end of his ministry. And they're building up sort of tension by doing that. In John's Gospel, Jesus quite regularly is in Jerusalem. He's there for one or other of the festivals, right? But what Matthew, Mark, and Luke do is they want to build this suspense because there's going to be this showdown, obviously, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, okay? And they're building that suspense. So it's a great kind of narrative, strategy they follow here. And Luke does this even better than anyone else, because in Luke, you've got this very long journey sequence, all the way back to chapter 9. We're in chapter 19, what we're looking at today. All the way back to chapter 9, Jesus, he's just predicted for the second time that he's going to die. And then we read that what? He firmly sets his face to go to Jerusalem, right? Because he knows that Jerusalem is the place where prophets die, okay? So he starts this journey, and he's moving towards Jerusalem. But again, the way that Luke tells the story is that there's sort of a counter. Jesus, he's announcing the kingdom. And as he's going towards Jerusalem, through his words and through his actions, he's explaining what God's rule, how God wants people to live, okay? He's sort of explaining what that looks like through his words, through his actions. But at the same time, there's this counter-narrative that comes out from Jerusalem. So you see where Jesus and Jerusalem are sort of on this collision course, right? Because, Jerusalem, but in particular the temple, because Jerusalem really is the center, but the epicenter of Jerusalem is the temple. And it's hard for us to appreciate just how influential the temple is in first century Judaism, okay? Think of the White House, the Capitol building. In other words, it's the government center. But add to that the Supreme Court, because you have the Sanhedrin, which is associated with that. Add to that, the Kennedy Center, because it's the cultural center. Add to that Washington Cathedral. Just think of all the monuments in Washington, D.C. that are there about different aspects, but all of that rolled into one, okay? That's the temple. So out from the temple goes a lot of influence. And sadly, a lot of that influence going out from the temple, out from Jerusalem, is contrary to the message that Jesus is bringing. So you basically have a collision of narratives on what does it mean to be the people of God. It's not surprising that one of the ways that Luke presents Jesus is as a prophet. Because what Jesus is doing, he's simply being faithful, which all prophets are, all true prophets are, faithful to what God has already revealed. Okay, so God already reveals how he wants his people to live in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And if you think of the prophets of the Old Testament, they're constantly referring back to those books. And that's what Jesus is doing. He understands well what God wants for his people. And he's communicating that as he makes his move towards Jerusalem. So now the suspense has been building, and now we come to that climactic moment when Jesus enters into Jerusalem. So what's the next thing as far as the meaning of Palm Sunday? He enters as a king, okay? Keep in mind, up till this point, he's been moving towards Jerusalem in much the same way many other Jews would be moving towards Jerusalem coming for Passover, because keep in mind, this is Passover season that he is going to Jerusalem for, right? He would be on foot. So much of this journey that we've just talked about, this is Jesus and his disciples walking towards Jerusalem. But as they get closer, he instructs his disciples to what? Get a colt. And as a king, because keep in mind, in the Old Testament, Davidic kings, how do they go to their coronation? Mounted, right? So Jesus gets on a horse. As we saw his disciples, they put garments on this colt. They put these garments on this colt, and for the last bit of his journey, he rides into Jerusalem. So he's arriving as a king. And what are they doing? They're putting their garments down in front of him, okay? And we see, this is echoing things we see also in the Old Testament, where oftentimes when someone might be proclaimed a king, those followers of him, to honor him and to show the dignity that is accorded to him, they would do this, take off their outer garments. The term that's used there is, well, as you know, you've probably seen pictures of, or you've probably seen enough Bible movies, what's described here is sort of that outer cloak that people would wear. And then under that, they would have kind of a tunic or a shirt, okay? But that's what they're doing. But again, and then what do they say? They say, blessed is the one, or blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. A quotation from Psalm 118, which was used in royal processionals, right? So the disciples of Jesus himself is acting the part. He's entering Jerusalem now as a king. He's been proclaiming what God's rule looks like. He is that Messiah. He is that anointed king of Israel. He is now entering Jerusalem, the city of the great king, in the right manner. His disciples recognize what is going on, and they, through their actions and through their acclamation, identify him as king, okay? Now, it'd be nice if that was how the story progressed. But as we know, we wouldn't be calling this Passion Week if it ended like that. Because what's the next thing we note is his kingship is rejected. So you've got Pharisees in the crowd who are basically saying to Jesus, rebuke your followers. Your followers should not be using this line out of this psalm, identifying you as a king. Rebuke them, silence them, stop them. And what does Jesus say? If they were to be silent, the very stones would cry out. But what it shows is that not everyone is going to receive Jesus as king. And of course, he knows this. Right before this, he tells a parable. And what's one of the main features of that parable? A nobleman goes off to receive royal kingship, and what? A delegation from his country go and say, we don't want this guy to be king. Jesus knows that a lot of people do not want him as their king because they prefer the other narrative, right? And the Pharisees are part of that. What's ironic so often in the Gospels is the people who should know better are the very people who buy into the false narrative. The legal experts, or what we would call the Torah experts, the people who know the books of Moses inside and out. The Pharisees, they also are teachers. The priests are teachers. The scribes are expert in these things. Sadly, those are the very people that opposed Jesus from the beginning because they've bought into a false understanding of what it means to be the people of God. And Jesus stands as a rebuke to them. Okay. So, moving to the next passage, and here we get into a part of Luke that is unique to Luke. So only Luke shares this episode with respect to Palm Sunday. And as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only known in this day the things that lead to peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes, for the days will come upon you when your enemies set up camp, construct ramparts, encircle you, press you in on every side, and they will crush you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone on another within you, all because you did not know the time of your visitation. Okay. But note, next slide, note, and you might recognize with this heading here, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. That comes from the book of Hosea, but it very much fits what Jesus is doing here. Because he's going to talk about knowledge, he's going to talk about destruction, okay? And there's a lack of knowledge that leads to this destruction, okay? Jesus weeps over the city. One thing that sometimes bothers me is Palm Sunday, part of my problem as a Bible teacher is we tend to over-sentimentalize things. You guys are probably expecting an upbeat message this morning on Palm Sunday. I remember I've been to many Palm Sunday services where you have children coming down the aisles waving palm branches, and it's all an upbeat, happy thing. Jesus is weeping on this day, right? We have to recognize sometimes you need to weep. If you're not weeping, you're not paying attention, okay? So when Jesus is weeping, we need to take a cue from that, okay? Because everything is not right with Jerusalem. Jesus knows that, okay? And even his disciples, they're not fully aware of what's going to play out over the next few days. But Jesus does know that, okay? Earlier in Luke's gospel, Luke has this beatitude, blessed are those who weep, same verb, right? Because they will laugh. But woe, Jesus says, woe to you who laugh now. You will weep and mourn. In other words, there's this somber aspect to Jesus. In Luke's gospel, we see Jesus celebrating all the time. But he also recognizes when it's appropriate to weep, we need to weep, right? I was reading something not too long ago, just a statistic, the CCLI, which is they license, with worship songs, for example, they license to churches, they're the kind of the licensee group that, as far as contemporary Christian music, right? And a person had done a study of all the top 100 songs sung in churches. And just to kind of put the statistic in a bit of a framework, in the book of Psalms, which was the worship book of Israel, 40% of the Psalms are laments. Almost half of the Psalms are laments. When this study was done of contemporary Christian music, less than 5% of the songs that churches sing regularly could qualify as lament, right? There's a big gap there. And none of the songs in the top 25 was God ever asked anything, or was anything ever said about why God, right? Which shows that we've kind of lost the ability to lament, because again, we have to be very careful we don't over-sentimentalize things. Again, I say to my students sometimes, if you're ever in charge of a church Christmas pageant, make sure you have the slaughter of the boys in Bethlehem, okay? And of course, everybody laughs at that because why would you want to put that in a Christmas pageant, but Matthew does. Because Matthew recognizes if you're going to tell the story of Jesus' birth and don't show the tragedy that happens at its birth, you're what? Papering over what's real about it. This is a provocative event. What is happening here in Jesus' ministry is a very provocative event. He realizes not everybody is tracking with him, and therefore he weeps. He's been spending months trying to persuade people as a prophet, but more than a prophet, as God's son, as the King of Israel, what it means to be the people of God, and they're not listening to him. And the leaders are content with their counter-narrative. Okay, so it's not surprising that Jesus weeps. Next point. Why is he weeping? Because of Jerusalem's refusal to know. Note what he says. He uses the verb to know twice in this lament. They should know, but they don't know the things that lead to peace. Okay? And they don't know that this is the time of visitation. Okay? Here again, their problem, why don't they know? Because they're not paying attention. They weren't reading their scriptures. They can't evaluate this other narrative that they're being sold all the time, right? Jesus holds the leadership accountable, but he also holds the people accountable. They all hear the Torah read every Sabbath, okay? They should know this, but they don't know the things that lead to peace, okay? And consequently, what? Destruction is going to come upon them, right? It shows that there's, the problem here is what we would call an epistemological problem, okay? Epistemology has to do with how do we know something and how do we assess that what we know is true? Because that's crucial. Especially, we're now in election season, right? This is a real strain on us epistemologically. How do we know what is true, right? How do we assess and evaluate? The people of God always have to do this. This is why we need to be very much rooted in what God has revealed, okay, and what God teaches us, because we need to make sure that we're always operating according to the truth as revealed to us in the Bible. But Jesus' critique of Jerusalem is they don't know. And it's this failure to know that leads to destruction. But it's important to keep in mind that in Hebrew way of thinking, to know is very relational. It's very experiential, right? It's not just like gain. In the modern West, we tend to think of knowledge as just simply intellectual. For the first century Jewish people and for ancient Israelites, and should be for us as Christians, to know is relational, right? The ultimate goal of God's revelation is that we would come to know him, okay? And it's sad that when the Messiah of Israel shows up at the door, they don't recognize that this is God in flesh appearing before them. Instead, most of them end up rejecting him, okay? We mentioned a moment ago that as he comes into the city, his disciples, they take off those cloaks, those outer garments, right? A few days later, what's going to happen to Jesus? Not only is his outer garment stripped from him, but his inner garments are stripped from him, right? As a king, he's totally rejected. He's totally shamed by the people he came to save, right? So he's this rejected king, but he's not lamenting. He's going to say later to women when he's on his way to his crucifixion, he says to the women of Jerusalem, "Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves. Weep for your children," right? So Jesus isn't weeping because he knows. He knew long before he even started that journey to Jerusalem how this was going to end. He's not fearful about himself, but he is saddened by the condition of the people. Okay? And consequently, next point here, the truth then is hidden from their eyes. Okay? You know, there's something very apocalyptic about the gospel, and I think I've used that term before, but just as a refresher, apocalyptic has to do with revelation, right? Jesus' ministry is all about revealing things to people. He's a prophet, after all. It's all about revealing God's truth to people. But what you also find so often in apocalyptic texts in the Bible is that if you don't accept that truth, what happens? You actually become blind. If you don't receive the truth, if you don't take in the truth that God gives you, it actually has the opposite effect on you. It shuts you down. You know, one of the verses that Luke quotes most often in both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts is Isaiah 6, 9 to 10. Isaiah's critique of his own generation, that these people have eyes, but what? They can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have hearts, but they can't understand, right? Israel was blind and deaf in Isaiah's day, and Jesus, he quotes Isaiah 6 often to describe his own ministry. And Paul, at the very end of the book of Acts, when he's in Rome speaking to the Jewish people there in Rome, that's the verse that he quotes to them. That's how the book of Acts ends, with an extended quotation of Isaiah 6, 9 to 10. Eyes become closed when you don't listen, when you don't recognize the prophet, when you don't recognize that God is now visiting you, when you don't listen to the story that is the story that brings life and peace and shalom and order. Think of that term, peace. What God created us for, we miss out on that because we're too blind to see. Okay? So again, it's very sober. You know, I don't want to be a downer today, but sometimes you need to be a downer, right? You know, to understand the good news, you need to see the bad news, right? The good news shines brightest when we fully understand the darkness of deception and falsehood and lies and just, you know, deceit, okay? That's why Jesus is weeping. The stranglehold that error has over the people of Jerusalem, right? You know, it's significant that right after this action here of entering the city, what's the first thing he does in Luke? He goes to the temple. He goes to that central institution. And Luke's account is the briefest of all four accounts of Jesus' action in the temple. And it leaves a lump in your throat, because this is all he says is this, basically. Jesus cast out, and he uses the exact same verb that's used earlier for what? Casting out demons. Jesus goes into the temple and he casts out the sellers. Doesn't talk about, you know, what they're selling. You know, just very brief. And here's that question: what is being sold at the temple, right? What's being purveyed? What's the product that is coming out from this temple? It's that very thing that Jesus has so many issues with. And it's almost like a demonic presence that Jesus has to cast out. So what Jesus does is he goes into the temple and he casts out the sellers, because that's the problem. The people of Jerusalem have been sold a bill of goods, as it were. They've been given the wrong story of what it means to be the people of God, to such an extent that it's blinded them. It's not surprising that Jesus will oftentimes accuse the Jewish leaders of being what? The blind leading the blind, right? Because they're selling something. You know, earlier in Luke, Jesus accuses the lawyers. And when you see lawyers in there, we're not talking about like attorneys, as we might think. These are what? Experts in the Torah, experts in the 5 books of Moses. What have they done? They've taken the key of knowledge. There's a reason why Israel doesn't have knowledge, because the very people that were to open their eyes have shut their eyes, right? So again, it's a very sobering picture that we have here, where Jesus, that temple institution that was to be the heart and soul and the life of the people, is something that has almost become possessed, that Jesus needs to come in there and drive something out. Okay, it's a very poignant scene that Luke describes there. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so what are the consequences of this time of visitation? Peace is postponed. You know, it's interesting. If you go back to the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 2, you have that famous scene of what? The shepherds watching over their flocks. Angels appear and announce what? Peace on earth, okay? That, God is about, God's salvation is now being announced. God is now present to bring healing, restoration, peace, wholeness, order to people, okay? But what's interesting in this passage, think of what comes right after the Psalm 118 quote, peace in heaven. The only time in the Bible where you have that language, peace in heaven, it's almost like peace on earth is being postponed, because Jesus comes as the king. He comes with this offer of salvation and shalom, and yet it's rejected. And so peace still remains in heaven, but peace on earth is yet to happen. Okay. You'd probably be wrong if I didn't have some rock music reference, so here it comes. Okay. In December 1969, right before Christmas, 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono paid for billboards in about 10 or 12, and keep in mind this is the height of the Vietnam War. So they paid for billboards in the downtown of like Times Square in New York City, Piccadilly Circus in London. You think of the hearts of these major democracies in Europe and Hong Kong and Tokyo and North America. And what did the billboards say? War is over if you want it. Merry Christmas, John and Yoko. Okay. It's something very prophetic here, because there's something they took a lot of heat for this, but I kind of like this, right? And they're doing this in democracies. War is over, but what? If you want it. God is already, I'm not sure if John Lennon's thinking as Jesus would be thinking, but God has already told us what makes for peace. This is why Christians were called to be peacemakers. It's not impossible, right? And we at least want to go down fighting for peace in that sense, right? Just as sort of a side point, kind of a writing project I'm presently working on is I'm interested in, since I grew up in conservative churches all my life, right? And yet I'm also kind of a child of the 60s, right? So I kind of grew up listening to the music of the late 60s, early 70s. I find it very interesting, if you look at the whole Vietnam era, and you look at the lyrics, and these are not Christians, but you look at the lyrics of the songwriters of the 60s and early 70s, when the Vietnam conflict is going on. I'm surprised at how biblical the imagery is that they use. And then when you look at what the churches are promoting at that same time, they're very much caught up in what? A Cold War narrative. We need to fight this fight. They kind of buy into, that narrative. They're not at all for peace. Even think in 1969, by the time John Lennon is making this statement, the State Department and the Pentagon have known for years Vietnam is not winnable. Like, they know that very early on, right? But what I find interesting, what I find sad, what makes me weep and continue to weep, is, why is the church oftentimes so blind? You know, I look at say, that thing, what churches are promoting in the late 60s, early 70s, and what these rock musicians who make no claim to be Christians, and yet they know their Bibles apparently better than these church bodies do, right? Because they're acting in a more prophetic kind of way, right? So in other words, when the people of God don't speak, the stones do literally cry out, right? God is going to have somebody speak his message, okay? If the church is blind, if the church is deaf, if the church is not, if listening, again, to the wrong voices. Okay, next statement here. And destruction is looming, okay? As you read the passage, we just read it a moment ago. The enemies are going to come, they're going to hem the city in, they're going to crush the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Not one stone will be left upon another. And as Jesus leaves the temple for the last time, he states that again. Not one stone of this temple is going to be left upon another, right? But what's interesting here is, again, just a word about judgment. Because sometimes people misunderstand God's judgments. God is not judging Jerusalem because, God's not petty. It's not like God saying, you rejected my son, so therefore I am going to have the Romans come and destroy you. God doesn't act like that. What God does is he shows them the way of peace. But when they choose a path other than that, he allows them to suffer the consequences of their choices, right? That's how the judgment of God always works. He graciously gives us what we need to thrive and flourish and seek after peace and all the goods of this present life. But when we, again, stop listening to that, stop seeing that, and choose another path, destruction becomes inevitable. Okay. Analogy I like to use about judgment with my students is, I don't give anybody an F, I don't give anybody an A. I lay out a syllabus, I lay out, here are things to read, here are assignments, here are exams. Choose your own adventure. The adventure you choose, you're going to end up with an F or you're going to end up with an A. And they'll say, well, Dr. Charette, can't you be more gracious to, they'll say this about 13 weeks into the semester. Dr. Charette, can't you be more graceful? And I said, well, I've been gracious the entire time. I created a course for you. I took time in the syllabus to pick the readings that are going to be the best readings for you as far as knowing this material. I give you assignments that are going to help you. I'm going to show up every day. You didn't show up every day, but I was there every day teaching you, right? My office, I have office hours if you have any questions or problems. In other words, sometimes we misinterpret grace. Sometimes I hear people say things like, I deserved an F, but Jesus gave me an A. That's not really how grace works. That's presumption, that's not grace. It's very significant to note that throughout the New Testament, salvation and justification is always on the basis of grace, but if you look at judgment, it's always based on what do you do after God has shown grace to you, right? And that's what this time of visitation is all about. It's the language that's used here. It's assessment time. It's review time. Jesus has been with this people. He's been countering these problems for months now. It's now time to give kind of a final report card, and that's essentially what he is doing at this point, okay? And then the last thing, it's interesting too, with all this language that Jesus uses here, he's obviously looking forward to what's going to happen in 40 years. He's saying this around 30 AD. 40 AD, Roman armies are going to circle the city of Jerusalem and destroy the city of Jerusalem. So Jesus, on the one hand, as a prophet, is predicting the events of AD 70, and yet what's interesting is the language that he uses here, which we just read, is all evocative of language that comes out of the Old Testament describing the destruction of 586 BC. And that tells us something about prophecy in the Bible. Prophets, there is a predictive aspect to prophecy, but prophets, mainly what prophets are doing is they know what God has already revealed in Moses and the previous prophets. They know that, and they know the story of Israel. And that's what prophets are based on. Jesus is looking back, right? You know, you can't go, thinking when you're driving your car, there's a reason why we have rear view mirrors. There's a reason why we have side rear mirrors, right? Because you can't really go forward properly without looking behind you. And Jesus knows the history of his people well, right? And you can't be a prophet without knowing your people, without knowing their history. Because, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but history has a way of rhyming. Because human nature doesn't really change, right? Because humans are basically the same, so it's not surprising you have these recurring patterns in history. Jesus knows that. He knows that he's not the first prophet to be rejected, far from it. He's not the first prophet who's going to die in Jerusalem. This has happened so many times before, but he's going to be faithful. The question is, are the people of Jerusalem going to be faithful? And are we going to be faithful? Are we going to listen to this and be the kinds of believers who want to have open eyes, open ears, and an open heart so that we can discern what God is doing and not miss this time of visitation? Let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you for the challenges that we see in your word. We thank you that we first of all just want to thank you for the greatest gift that you gave us, the gift of your Son. And we thank you that he is our King, and he is this one who continues to speak to us. Even today, even right now, the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of Jesus is speaking through us in this auditorium. If you're here today and you hear that voice, you hear the Spirit telling you that maybe you've been blind, maybe you don't know as well as you think you know. You don't have that relational knowledge of God. And you're moving in the dark, moving as a blind person, even though you don't even fully recognize that. I just pray that as the Spirit speaks to you, you would respond. Don't reject that voice as you hear it today. As when we finish up here, please come forward, seek me out, seek Pastor John out, seek Vida out, Pastor Vida, seek anybody on the leadership team. And we just pray that today, think of today as this day of visitation. God has shown up to call you to himself. Don't reject that voice, but respond positively. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.